Hey everybody, this is Brandon McDonald. I'm a master's student in the Deer Lab under Dr. Lashley, and I am giving a lecture on endangered species today and what it means to be an endangered species, some of the history and management of the concept, and then some special considerations and challenges when dealing with these kind of species. And my focal species, the key largo wood rat, is actually an endangered species itself. And I'll talk more about them in a special lecture where I kind of go over what I've been doing and some of the history with them. But for now, let's get right into it. So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the concept of endangered species, and you can probably have a bunch of examples that come to mind right off the top of your head. For instance, maybe you think of the California condor out west, or right here in our own state down in South Florida, we have the Florida panther. That's been a really big ongoing project to kind of help them recover from the brink. But, you know, we have two pretty charismatic animals here, but animals aren't the only organisms that can be considered endangered. Plants are also, there's plenty of endangered plants. And the longleaf pine that we have up in the northern part of the state into southern Georgia and Alabama is a great example of this. And again, all of these are kind of like big charismatic things that we think about that get a lot of attention. But plenty of other species are also considered endangered, such as the American burying beetle, which is one of the largest decomposing beetles. They eat decaying matter, and they have a really important ecosystem service from that. There's the humpback chub, which I would be very surprised if any of you have actually heard of before, but they're a fish that's native to the rivers in the Grand Canyon, and they had some negative impacts as the damming projects for the Colorado River restricted their ability to get between habitat. And so some species like these two are unlikely to get as much attention as a condor or a Florida panther. They're a lot easier to miss, but they're still having trouble, and that's kind of why they get categorized this way. And really, there are endangered species all over the place. We can find them even right in our backyard, such as with the gopher tortoise right here in northern Florida around Alachua County. In fact, Dr. Lashley and some of the other students working in the lab actually work with gopher tortoises a little bit out at Ordway Swisher. And so real quick, I thought this was a really cool tool that is available on the Center for Biological Diversity website. And with this tool, you can search for what endangered species are present in an area based on address or county. So, you know, I grew up in North Carolina, and I went to North Carolina State University in Wake County for my undergraduate. So I thought it would be kind of cool to go ahead and take a look at this. So all you have to do to get this to work well is that you type in the name of an address or area that you're interested in, and it'll highlight it on the map and kind of zoom in a little bit. And then you'll get this little box over the area that you're interested in. And then when you click the arrow, it'll give you a couple options. And looking into those options will give you a little table that shows you all the endangered species that are present in that area. So as you can see, in Wake County, North Carolina, there are 6 different endangered species, a couple bats, a woodpecker, some mussels, and a plant. So it's really cool to just kind of see, and you might be surprised just what might be in your backyard from where you grew up or where you're living right now. So I highly recommend just taking a look at this, and I'll try and put a link on the Canvas page so you guys can take a look-see at what might be in some areas that you've lived in before, or you've been to before. So when it gets down to it, we've seen a couple different examples of endangered species, from big charismatic things to smaller species and unknown species that many people might not have heard of or interact with on a regular basis. So what exactly is an endangered species? And, it's hard to have a really perfect definition for this concept. But in essence, the simplest definition is that an endangered species is a species at risk of extinction. And this definition will vary a little bit depending on what organization you talk to or what legislation that it's being defined in. Because, in some cases, it's important to have a formal definition. But for us going forward, we'll stick with this. Any species at risk of extinction, maybe even put immediate risk of extinction in there, is our best definition for what it means to be endangered for now. And so real quick, we've talked about a couple examples, and we've talked about this before in some of the discussions earlier in the class, but why would we even bother conserving species that aren't doing too well, that are declining for some reason? And one important reason is that biodiversity itself has a lot of value. There's intrinsic value in nature, and there's a bunch of studies about this, about how people just enjoy being out in nature and how it can help with all sorts of things. There's an economic value in both tourism and trade, and then also ecosystem services and ecosystem function. Without having some key species in an area, you might lose a whole lot of important things and how that ecosystem works. And currently, there's a lot of negative conditions present in our era that are causing a lot of declines in species, caused by both humans and other natural happenings, from adverse weather and all sorts of things that would normally happen. But the extinction rate of species right now is a little bit higher than what it normally is. And a lot of people consider us to be in a 6th grade extinction event, similar to the massive die-offs of species that happened several times in the past, such as when the dinosaurs went extinct millions of years ago. But there's a whole lot to consider here, and obviously species have value, and I hope we've gotten that point across a lot, though there are ethical questions about whether it's worth it to conserve some species, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. For now, let's jump into a bit of the history of endangered species and how we got to this point. So this will be a bit of a review in a lot of cases, but some of the first legislation that we really start thinking about where people consider species were at risk of going extinct could be the Lacey Act that we talked about way back in the first module of this course. So in the 1900s, as passenger pigeons, which were at one point one of the most abundant birds in the world, were declining pretty heavily, and that influenced some people to put legislation forth to try to regulate hunting, and then other legislation as well, such as the Migratory Bird Act, helped give some of these species that were starting to be realized that might be at risk. They weren't just this unlimited resource. And so as the 1900s moved on, we start to see a couple of other things happen. In the 60s was really when stuff started to get moving. So in 1964, the IUCN Red List, which is another thing that the IUCN is, of course, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they do all sorts of stuff with conservation of ecosystems and individual species. But in 1964, they first created the Red List, which is essentially a database of species all across the world and how their populations are doing, whether they're doing well and they don't need a lot of help, or whether they're endangered or threatened or at risk of extinction and they might need a lot of help. And this is very frequently used, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Also in this same time, the first endangered species legislation in the US that was really focused specifically on a select group of species was published in the same year of 1964, which is called the Red Book, which is basically just a document, the first official document in the US, talking about which species were in danger. And then moving on, 1966, we get to the Endangered Species Preservation Act, which had a goal of conserving, protecting, restoring, and propagating certain species of wildlife. And this was a bunch of species, including the whooping crane, like is pictured here, that were deemed to be heavily declining and at risk of disappearing for one reason or another. And this first list, there was 75 different species, and all of which were vertebrate animals, actually. There were no insects and there were no plants in this first list. And of course, 75 is not that many, but it was an important step in the right direction. And this Endangered Species Preservation Act eventually gave way to the Endangered Species Act in the US, which is still our main legislation protecting endangered species today. A lot of other governments have similar programs to the Endangered Species Act and organizations and policies. But this is the big one in the US. And also, 2 years later, also related to the IUCN, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is commonly abbreviated as CITES, was passed as well. And this is an international agreement. I think there's about 180 different countries supporting it in the modern day, that deals with the trade of endangered species and in products of endangered species. And this can include both plants and animals, as indicated by the flora and fauna. So obviously there's a whole bunch of different groups and organizations and legislation from around the world that deals with these kinds of issues. But to keep it simple, I'm going to mainly focus on the Endangered Species Act here in the US and the IUCN Red List going forward, just to kind of break down how these two pieces of information, which in our cases are probably some of the most common ones that we'll use when evaluating the status of species here in the US. And we'll just take a more in-depth look at these two pieces of legislation. So in the Endangered Species Act, there are two different levels of protection that a species can have, either threatened or endangered. So in the actual document of the Endangered Species Act, an endangered species is defined as any species that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Though they do actually add in a little caveat there, saying that if that species is considered a pest, especially if it's an insect and it's going extinct, it is out of luck for any protection. So if there's an endangered aphid, it probably is not going to get a whole lot of attention here, which I thought was kind of an interesting little side note. But anyway, moving on. And then threatened species are defined as any species which is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And so these are kind of vague, and we'll get more into that a little bit, but I do want to point out that when these two terms are defined in the Endangered Species Act, which is often abbreviated as the ESA, they do include subspecies and distinct populations of species for vertebrates as under the umbrella term species. So in this case, even if it's not the full set of the species, it can get protection. For example, again, I work with key largo wood rats, and they are actually a subspecies of the eastern wood rat that is only found on Key Largo. And the eastern wood rat is not listed as endangered, but they have a population that spreads from central Florida all the way up the East Coast and into the Appalachian Mountains, whereas the Key Largo wood rat is restricted to just a small portion of the northern end of Key Largo. And because subspecies are okay in this case, that is, they're able to get protection through this act. And so there's a whole lot of different information contained in the Endangered Species Act about with legal jargon and how everything makes sense. And there's a few different sections that really break down how everything is put forward. And most of them are prefaced by the phrase using the best available science. But going forward, we don't really know what that means. And we've seen that we have these two kind of open definitions for what it means to be an endangered or threatened species under this block of legislation. And so to actually have a background for what this means, there are several factors that are outlined in the document that explain the cause or reason for a species facing an increased extinction risk. And the 5 factors that we're about to go over are really the actual science and data part of what this all means. So the first is if there's significant damage or destruction to the habitat of a species. So, obviously if there's no habitat, food, water, cover, shelter, and space, then a plant or animal is not really going to be able to do very well. The next is overutilization. So this is especially important for game species or fish or anything that gets harvested in some way. If you overdo it, don't take a sustainable yield, then you can cause a lot of population problems, which can lead to declines. Next is if they face disease or predation. And, this is especially important now as a lot of non-native species interact with species in different ways that we might not expect. And, ecosystems are very complicated. So adding another rung or removing a rung can have big implications for the species that are present. And then if a fourth one, which seems kind of obvious, if the protection that a species currently gets, which, in a lot of cases, if a species wasn't listed before, it's not receiving any protection. It's, but it might need special management to do well. And then finally, any other natural or man-made factors that are affecting the continued existence of this species. And of course, again, these are pretty broad, and they do go into detail a little bit more in the definitions within the actual legal document. But for the purposes of this class, we're not going to go much farther than this. What we do need to know is that these are all essentially just outlines. And if any species can meet at least one of these factors, then it's a candidate for listing, but it of course needs to be evaluated by the agencies that are in charge of this, which for terrestrial and freshwater species are the Fish and Wildlife Service here. And then in any marine species is the Fisheries Service. And so in addition to the species themselves, we also often try to protect the habitat, as I mentioned, and kind of zoomed in on that first topic, the first factor about the status of the habitat of endangered species in the last slide. Whenever it's possible, they try to protect the critical habitat of the species. And this is the definition that we have on the screen right now, which is the area that a given species occurs in that contains all of the biotic and abiotic features essential for the conservation of that species. So, if we get this with translocation sometimes, if you try to move a species somewhere else, the habitat that you move them to might not contain every key aspect that they need to do really well. And this is important to keep around, because if a species is protected as much as we can, but they don't have suitable habitat, then obviously that's not going to be able to do too much. And it's usually not the entire range of the species. but it can be outside of their current range if there's planning for the future. And the Endangered Species Act also limits both the public and private sectors about what they can do with species that are endangered or critical habitat that is being protected for an endangered species. So anything that could infringe upon the habitat, damage it, or disturb the species is typically prohibited, and that could include hunting, construction, trade, development, anything like that. And to actually work in those areas, or if you're doing any kind of research with endangered species, you need to get a special permit through the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Marine Fisheries Service. And doing anything like this without getting a permit can lead to big fines, actually. So currently there are 2,363 different species protected under the Endangered Species Act in the US. And about 1,700 of them are native species, and then an additional 700 are actually species found outside the US, which, considering this is the United States Endangered Species Act, that might sound a little bit strange, but they're listed to prevent any major illegal trade. And a lot of times it's really big, charismatic animals. Again, like I have the elephant pictured here. And I'm sure we've all heard about some of the things that happen with the ivory trade and how that can be, very negatively impact these species. And this is just kind of us doing our part to help it. And it relates directly to the CITES, which I talked about a little bit before in the history, which is basically boils down to, it's an international trade agreement with a whole bunch of different countries that have all agreed to limit the trade of these endangered species and look out for both wildlife and their products like ivory for elephants and elephant tusks or rhino horns and the like, and bird feathers, a whole bunch of stuff. It also is big in plants. If you have some time, rosewood is a really interesting group of trees that grows in tropical forests that is not doing very well, but it's a really pretty wood, and it's often used in furniture and also in guitars. A lot of really nice guitars are made of rosewood, and because of that, there's a legal market for it. And it's a very interesting to kind of look at it from the vegetation side. So if you have some time, I encourage you to take a little bit to look that up. And I won't go too much into CITES because I think I'm already going kind of long here, but essentially they break it down into 3 different appendices, where the first appendix is species that are at immediate extinction risk. They're really, really not doing well at all, and any kind of trade of any sort of themselves or their products could cause them to go extinct. And then Appendix 2 is species that, they could be maybe more like similar to what the threatened category in the Endangered Species Act is. And then there's a third appendix that is just for individual countries that have species of concern that they want to be considered, but maybe not quite as big of an issue in the international trade area. And then I will mention that all of the legislation is available online if you want to look more into some of the rules and definitions here. And I'm also going to try to put a link to a short video that kind of goes over some of the different sections of the Endangered Species Act on Canvas for you guys to look at. So now we will move on to the IUCN Red List, which is not legislation. It is just a very large database of many, many, many different species and what their conservation status is. And though it is not a legislative body, it is often used by many governments and academia and many organizations just because it has so much information, and it is often updated, by many different groups to keep a nice, good current information going, though there are a lot of species that are not listed. So there are 9 different categories on the IUCN Red List. And I'm sure, again, you've probably seen some of these. So they range from not evaluated, which means that the species hasn't had anything done, all the way to extinct. And 3 of those categories are referred to as the threatened categories. And these are what we're concerned with today, the species that are at some kind of extinction risk. And so from the highest extinction risk to the lowest, we have critically endangered, which are classified as facing an extremely high risk of extinction, endangered, a very high risk of extinction, and vulnerable, which is a high risk of extinction in the wild. Again, we kind of get this whole vague definition again, but these are just supposed to be really big categories that encompass a very, very wide variety of different species. And to fit into those categories, the IUCN uses 5 very specific and quantitative criteria that they break down very well in the documentation online. But I'll go through like the bases of these criteria right here. And they make a point before I get started real quick that these are not the causes of the endangerment, they're the symptoms, like what you would be looking for in a species that would be endangered. They're not outlining the causes. That's what different academic groups and other things we'll be looking at later. But these are what we can look out for to tell that a species might not be doing too well. So the first is that there's a reduction in population size in the past, the present, or if it's predicted in the future through some kind of population modeling or analysis. And they break this criteria down a little bit more, that it has to be based on at least 10 years of measurements or 3 generations of the species. So from one individual growing to adulthood and reproducing, then their offspring growing to adulthood and reproducing, and then their offspring growing to adulthood and reproducing. So they can really see that there's enough data and get an idea of what the trend is going with. The second factor is that there's a reduction in geographic range size, or there's a lot of fragmentation. The third is that they have the species has a small or declining population size and also works in fragmentation as well. The fourth is that there are very small population with a restricted distribution, which seems similar to number 3, but I'm going to go into an example with this in just a second. And then the fifth is that there's a quantitative analysis of extinction risk, which can also be used to inform the first, but this would be something like a population viability analysis modeling. And again, as I mentioned before, these are the symptoms of endangerment, not the causes. So just real quick, to get a better idea of exactly how this works, we'll talk about the very small populations with the restricted distribution category. So I brought up a little image of a table directly from their documentation here. So under this, this criteria, the very small restricted population size, for an animal to be listed as critically endangered, their population size would have to be less than 50 total individuals in the population. And you can see that there's a slightly different cutoff for the endangered and the vulnerable. And these quantitative thresholds like this, it's very clear. Like if you can get a nice estimate of the abundance of a certain species, you can be like, oh, this could be considered endangered, or oh, this could be considered vulnerable. It's very clear, it's set in stone. It's not quite like the Endangered Species Act where you could just kind of be like, oh yeah, this seems like it's happening. And these thresholds, while they're clear, they're also generalized so they can fit a very wide range of species. As you know, many species have different biology and they might not work the same way. Like you wouldn't necessarily expect the population of an insect to behave exactly the same way as you'd expect a population of a perennial plant, for example. And some of these different categories in these criteria also have additional arguments to keep things a little bit more clear. Like you can see here that for the vulnerable species, since once you get up to around 1,000, you have a decent population size. It also brings in that whole restricted population to a very small area. Argument there. And so currently there are 120,000 plus species on the red list in all of the different categories, and about a quarter of those are in the threatened category. So either threatened, endangered, or critically endangered. And up here on the graph I'm showing here, it's just showing some of the trends in different major groups of species on the red list. So you can see that corals are really not doing too well, but a lot of other species are kind of holding constant. But then if you look over at this y-axis here, you can see that their survival in general of all the species they've evaluated is less than 1, meaning that there's some kind of loss going on there. And then that blue line is the overall trend in all species. All right, so we've talked about some of the major different ways we categorize endangered species and legislation to deal with them. But how do we actually go about managing species that are, not doing too well? So there are a lot of different strategies that we can take to manage endangered species. And they can come from the habitat side, which is often a really good route to take, because protecting the habitat can often protect more than just that one key species that we're focusing on. And this is often a common trend in this kind of work. So you could do things like establish protected areas like national parks or wildlife reserves. You could try to remove invasive species and plant natives, like at the picture down here. This guy is going in and getting rid of some invasive weedy plants in an aquatic system, and providing artificial structures or doing other kinds of habitat improvement can also help different endangered species persist in the environment. And then in addition to habitat management, sometimes we have to do things a little bit more directly with the endangered species. And this could be something like translocation, which might mean that a population is so low or habitat is just so, it's deteriorated to a point where it can't really support the species anymore due to fragmentation or some other cause. And we have to take more drastic measures. So translocation involves moving a species from one area to another area. And we talked about with the Endangered Species Act, protecting critical habitat, which can allow for some of this to happen if one area kind of gets left out. Alternatively, to just moving species, we can try to breed populations that are really low if we can get a good amount of adults that represent a good genetic diversity of the species, because you don't want the species to suffer from problems like inbreeding and all sorts of things. Though captive breeding is very difficult, and while there are some big success stories, such as the California condors pictured here, or black-footed ferrets, it's very difficult and sometimes doesn't quite work out. It's also very costly and time-consuming. And here you can see they had to use puppets to raise the condor chicks so they wouldn't imprint as much on the people working with the program. And no matter what strategy is employed, it's very important that there is careful management and monitoring throughout the whole time to make sure these interventions are working. If we just, left a species as it is, then we won't really know what's going on. And our ultimate goal is always to remove a listed species after it's recovered from the list and know that they're doing well for at least the foreseeable future. So let's talk about a little bit of a hypothetical dilemma here, since there's so many different species. And as I mentioned a little bit with the captive breeding, we often have limited time and funding to go around and help out these species. So let's say we have species A, this little cartoon cat here, and then species B, which is this ox or cow. So species A is critically endangered. It's really, really not doing well. And species B is endangered, and we're using the IUCN Red List categories here. So, from a immediate standpoint, we might think, oh, well, we should focus on species A because it's critically endangered, so it's at a higher risk of extinction. And from this much information, maybe that is our best option. But let's think about it in terms of the hypothetical needs and requirements of these species. And of course, this is just all something I've made up, but I think it kind of helps get the point across that you can't just jump into these things without thinking about them a little bit. So I've created these little areas here, and I'm going to call them habitat clouds, which is kind of dumb, but bear with me here. So species A, our cat-like species, has a bunch of trees that have some water and a stump. And we'll say that everything inside these habitat clouds is aspects that the species requires to be successful. As you see, it's a pretty large area compared to the ones for species B, and there's a lot more different features in there that are necessary for their survival. Whereas species B can exist in smaller areas. They can have slightly smaller populations and be fine. And, so now we're starting to think, well, that's a whole lot of requirements for species A, and species B doesn't quite have these many. So let's kind of just go through all these different aspects. So species A has a lot of requirements, and there's not a whole lot of other habitat areas that they currently exist in or that match what they exist in. We just have this one big space. Whereas species B has only a couple of requirements that it seems like they need, and there's several different areas where they exist in another area that looks like maybe it could have them in the future. So this would likely translate to species A being pretty expensive to manage, whereas species B might be a little bit more reasonable because you have more options and you don't have to put as much into making sure an area has everything it needs. And so this might, in the end, ultimately translate to a lower chance of success for this species that has very specific requirements. So if we started with species A and tried to conserve them, we might end up getting to the point where everything we plan ends up with them going extinct anyway, even though we put all this time and effort into doing it. And then if we spend all our time and effort on species A, that might result in species B going extinct. So this just is kind of designed to show you that it's really important to think very carefully about the species and the system that they are in when you're dealing with these kinds of situations, because it's, as we've gone over many times before, ecosystems are very complex, and some species have very complex needs. And it comes down to being an ethical dilemma, like many of the other things we've talked about in this class. There's no simple solution as to what the right answer is, but we can kind of maximize what we can do by looking at the situation, understanding as much as we can about the species, and also adapting whenever we need to. If something isn't working, it's probably better to reevaluate that issue and try something different. So that's one of the big challenges, is what we just went through. But there are plenty of other challenges for managing endangered species, and honestly managing species in general. The biggest is that nature itself is uncertain. There's a lot of stochasticity, which is just, things happen randomly. You never know when some weather event might change something. You could have a drought all of a sudden. And, you're also working with living beings, which aren't necessarily going to be cooperating with whatever strategies you're trying to do, even if you're trying to help them, because they don't necessarily know that that is your goal. And of course, we have a lot of human-driven activity, like we mentioned earlier, which can be development, introduction of non-native species, and possibly invasive species, which of course is another can of worms, but all sorts of things. And, we have climate change too, which is also kind of related to both of these topics. And the modern, we might have more extreme weather events, changing temperatures that species aren't prepared for. And this is another thing that we have to keep in mind here, especially in our current era where all this stuff is happening. We're seeing a lot of extinction risk all over the place. Also, for example, the Endangered Species Act is legislation, and it's subject to politics, and sometimes it performs better or worse depending on the administration that's in power at the time. You never know if it doesn't fit a certain political party's agenda or a certain group's agenda. They can lobby for different things, and we see this sometimes on both sides, with people lobbying for adding species to the list or people talking about removing species from the list. We've had wolves in the Yellowstone area come up quite a few times, and they were originally endangered when the reintroduction program for them started back, I think it's coming up on 30 or 40 years ago at this point. But now there's a whole lot of going back and forth, and whether or not they should be considered endangered is a big issue out there. Also, funding, as I mentioned in our hypothetical scenario, is another big thing. There's only so much money available, unfortunately, to protect these species. And so sometimes we have to make tough decisions about what we can maximize our gains with. And by gains, I mean how we can conserve a species the best. And of course, it's also difficult to measure populations themselves for these species. It's often very tricky to count, every species in a group, as we talked about in several weeks ago with the lectures on different means of measuring populations. And then, it's hard to tell where one population ends and begins, which can be tricky in some of the legislative ways. And another big challenge is that there's taxonomic bias in how species are represented. And I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, where we talked about some of the bigger charismatic groups and the smaller, less known organisms that probably get a lot less attention. But this goes into the Endangered Species Act and the Red List as well. Almost all of the species on the Endangered Species Act and 3/4 of the species on the Red List, on the IUCN Red List, are from terrestrial and freshwater systems, which are, they're easier for us to get to. And also, the majority of the species on both lists are also vertebrate animals. So invertebrates don't get as much representation, even though there are plenty of them, such as the burrowing beetle I mentioned earlier. They're not doing too hot. And a lot of the times we might not even notice that they're not doing too hot because they don't get as much attention, which is another potential issue with the current way we do things. And so obviously marine species and invertebrates get much less attention. And plants also receive a lot less attention than animals do, which is unfortunate in a lot of cases. And then when you get right down to it, there are almost no organisms other than plants and animals listed. I think there might be 3 species of fungi among the 120,000+ species on the IUCN Red List. Though, to be fair, the Red List have addressed some of their biases and have stated a desire to correct them, but that will take a lot of time to get through. So that's pretty much everything for this lecture on endangered species, and I apologize, this went way longer than I meant for it to. But in summary, endangered species are any species that's at risk of extinction, and they can be protected by legislation, such as the Endangered Species Act or other similar legislative bodies in other countries. We have really great tools like the IUCN Red List that keep a database of all these species that is widely used by all sorts of other governments and conservation groups. And management for endangered species can be tricky and often requires us to navigate through a lot of different options and really think about what's going on depending on the situation. And finally, there are a lot of challenges to working with endangered species. And that is everything for now. There's going to be a couple of resources linked on Canvas, like I said before, and also there's going to be another lecture where I'm going to go into my study species, the key largo wood rat, which I promise will be much shorter than this one, and just talk about a little bit the history of that species and what we're doing to conserving it. And thanks for listening.